so much for joining us for today's webinar on the TN visa. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I am a Senior Associate with Scott Legal PC here in New York City. A few housekeeping items before we get started on our presentation. Our firm is a full-service immigration firm. So though we do focus on business immigration, we actually handle the full spectrum of U.S. immigration law, whether that's family-based immigration, whether that is temporary visas like visitor visas or student visas, etc. So we hope that you'll reach out to us if you have any questions at all about really anything affecting your immigration journey in the U.S. One thing that does set us apart is the fact that our founder, Ian Scott, has personally applied for and held numerous visas in the U.S., from the F1 to the H-1B, the TN, which we're talking about today, the E-2. So his experience navigating that process really does define how we work with our clients. Now, if you do have a question, we do plan to get through all of the questions during today's presentation. If you do have a question, send it in using either the Q&A function on Zoom or the chat function, and I will be monitoring both of those. So I might save questions for the end, but don't let that hold you back. Send those in, and I'll get back to them before the end of the presentation. Also, after this presentation, you'll receive an email with a copy of the PowerPoint that you see on your screen, so no need to take comprehensive notes. We will be sending you the PowerPoint presentation you see. This webinar is also being recorded. We will be posting it to our YouTube channel. Our YouTube channel is actually a wonderful resource, and in that email we'll send to you, we'll have a link to the channel. Not only do we have our full-length webinars, we also include shorter videos, and those do span the full spectrum of U.S. immigration law. So we hope you'll check those out and find them helpful. During the presentations, we tend not to get into questions specific to individuals on the webinar. If you do want to talk about your circumstances, please do schedule a consultation. We would be very happy to talk with you about the details of your circumstances during a consultation. And again, a link will be in that email we'll send to you afterward. Finally, this webinar is part of a series. We do hope you'll sign up for future webinars. Again, they run the full spectrum of U.S. immigration law. We try to do at least 2 a week or so, so please do check those out, sign up, and we hope to see you on future webinars. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the TN visa. So the TN visa is for nationals of Canada or Mexico who want to come to the U.S. to work. When someone comes to us and they have a job offer in the United States, or they are likely to receive a job offer, they're looking for a job in the U.S., and they have a passport from Canada or Mexico, the TN visa really is one of the first things we consider, and that's because it is one of the fastest, most streamlined, simplest work visas to apply for. So if you have a passport from Canada or Mexico and you have a job offer in the U.S., there really are few, if any, better options than the TN, depending on your circumstances. So what are the requirements? So I mentioned it's for nationals of Canada or Mexico. So you do need to have a passport from Canada or Mexico. You do not need to have been born in Canada or Mexico. So if you were born in India and you naturalized in Canada, that is perfectly fine. If you hold a Canadian passport, you do meet this nationality requirement for the TN visa. Next is that you need to be coming to the U.S., and I just realized that I am not sharing my PowerPoint, so let me go ahead and do that. All right, so hopefully you can all see that. Let me know if you cannot. So the next requirement you see after the requirement that you must be a citizen of Canada or Mexico, you must hold a passport from Canada or Mexico, is that your profession must appear on the list of professions in the TN regulations. So what does this mean? So in the regulations, if you're at your computer, I actually recommend that you Google NAFTA, N-A-F-T-A, TN regulations. NAFTA is the treaty that established the TN visa. It's a treaty between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So Google NAFTA, TN regulations, and when you pull those up, you'll actually see a list of professions. It starts with accountant, then architect, and it really runs the gamut from management consultants to dentists, psychologists, agriculturalists, as well as college, seminary, and university teachers. So really there are dozens of TN professions. But there are certain professions that are not on the list. So for example, marketers are not on the list, and there are others. So what's important is that you need to be coming to the US to fill one of the professions that's actually listed in the TN regulations. Okay? Now, you also must be qualified to practice that profession. And what does this mean? What this means is that you need to meet the qualification in the regulations. So let's take an example. If you look at the NAFTA TN regulations, and let's take economist as an example. After economist, you see baccalaureate or licenciatura degree. So that is how you qualify as an economist. You need a bachelor's degree in economics to qualify as an economist. To take another example, accountant. You need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree or a professional license in accounting. So you see that accountants are different from economists. Economists need a bachelor's degree. They can't have a professional license that qualifies them. Accountants, they can qualify based on a bachelor's degree or a professional license. Let's take one more example. If we look at management consultants, we see baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or equivalent professional experience that is equivalent to 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. So here you see management consultants can qualify based on experience alone, if it's 5 years of experience as a management consultant or in the field of specialty that's related to the consulting agreement. So you need to first define what profession am I coming to the US to practice? And second, do I have the qualification? Do I meet the qualification as it's stated in the NAFTA regulations? Now again, to be very clear, when you get a job offer, the US employer might have qualifications beyond the NAFTA requirements. So let's say you get an offer from a US employer. They want to hire an economist with 20 years of experience. That's fine. They can do that. But that's the employer's requirement. That's not the TN requirement. So in your TN application, it's very important to make clear how you qualify based on the TN regulations. So if you're applying for that job as an economist, you want to make it clear you qualify because you have a bachelor's degree in economics. You don't want to mention that the employer wants 20 years of experience in the part of the application where you're explaining how you qualify for the visa. Okay, so this qualification requirement on your screen is qualifying for the profession based on the TN regulations. Next, you need to have a prearranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the US. So you do need to actually have a job offer before you apply for the TN visa. The TN visa is not a visa that you can use to come to the US and look for a job. For that, a B1 visa might be a better fit for Canadians. They are visa exempt. They might be able to come in to look for a job as a visa exempt Canadian if they're entering in B1 status. But the TN, you actually do need that job offer in hand before you're applying for the TN. Next, in the job, you must be employed to engage in the professional activities that are consistent with the listed profession. So what does this mean? This means, to give you an example, if you are coming in as an economist, to continue with our example, you need to actually be performing the job duties of an economist in the job that you've been offered. You cannot, for example, come in and work as a marketer or work as a mathematician if you are being approved as an economist. How do you know what the job duties of an economist are, or in any of these professions? How do you know that your job duties are aligned with those that the government thinks someone in this job does? The answer is the Occupational Outlook Handbook. I'm going to move to the next slide real quick before we come back. This is the home page of the Occupational Outlook Handbook for economists. And again, if you're at your computer, I recommend you Google OOH, Occupational Outlook Handbook. economist, just as an example. Pull up that page and you'll see there are certain tabs. Here you see the summary tab. There's also a tab, what they do. If you click that tab, what they do, you will actually see a list of job duties. Now again, this is for economists. You can do this for any of the professions in the TN regulations. These are the job duties that the government thinks an economist does. So if you are applying as an economist, you want to make sure that your job duties, as they're explained in your TN application, are aligned with these job duties. That doesn't mean that they are copied and pasted. You should not just copy and paste the job duties. They need to be consistent. So you do want to make sure you are doing job duties in your job that are consistent with what is stated in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. Excuse me. Excuse me. So Occupational Outlook Handbook is a very important resource. You do want to make sure your job duties are aligned with it. Going back to our previous slide, the last bullet on your screen is your degree must match the job description. All right. What does this mean? I mentioned before that if you're applying as an economist, the only way you can qualify through the TN regulations is a degree. It's a bachelor's or a licenciatura degree. What does that degree need to be in? Well, clearly, if your bachelor's degree is in economics, you qualify because you're applying as an economist. Your degree is in economics. That's clearly aligned. But what if your degree is in math, or your degree is in finance? Or what if your degree is in French or English? So if your degree is, let's take the difficult example. Let's say your degree is in English or French. That degree is not related to economics on the face of it. So you would that does increase the risk of denial, but there are certain things you can do to strengthen your application. So first of all, you would want to look at your transcript. Include your transcript in the application. And if you took any classes related to economics, even though you majored in French or English, if you took classes related to economics, you would highlight those on your transcript and include it in your application. And you would make sure to emphasize in your cover letter in the application that you did actually complete a course load that prepares you to work as an economist. Some other things you can do. You might get a letter from the department chair at your university talking about how your course load, your degree actually does qualify you to work as an economist. So a letter from the university can be very helpful. So you want to think creatively. If your degree is related or unrelated, what arguments can you make to show that the degree actually was related when you look at the transcript, when you look possibly at independent research? If you wrote a thesis on economics, you would emphasize that. All right, so if your degree, though, is related but not exactly aligned. So for example, as an economist, what if your degree is in math or in finance? Well, you would do the same thing that I just described. You would include your transcript, emphasize the economics related courses you took, but you also might be able to use the Occupational Outlook Handbook to your advantage. So there is a tab at the top of the OOH. If we're on the economist page, let's change that slide. And you look here, how to become one. Click that tab and you will see that it says education. Candidates who have a bachelor's degree with sufficient course credits in economics, statistics, or mathematics may qualify for some entry-level economist positions. All right, so you want to look for language like that, that talks about how related coursework or a related degree actually can qualify you for the job. All right, so use the Occupational Outlook Handbook to your advantage. Next, probably the most common question we get regarding the TN visa is, does it require sponsorship? So let's define what sponsorship is. Sponsorship has a specific meaning in U.S. immigration law, and it is basically in the context of green cards or in the context of the H-1B visa, where the employer needs to take some very specific steps. So for example, for an H-1B or for a green card, an employment-based green card, the employer may need to advertise the job, might need to see if there are other able and willing U.S. workers before they offer the job to the foreign national. They might need to offer a prevailing wage, which is higher than the minimum wage. They might need to be very specific about the geographical location where the worker will be working. None of that applies to the TN visa. And for this reason, we do say the TN visa does not require sponsorship. Okay, the TN visa does not require a prevailing wage. You just need to meet the requirements that apply to any other employee. So you have to pay minimum wage, of course, but you don't have to pay a prevailing wage. You don't need to test the labor market before you hire someone on a TN. You don't need to be very strict about the geographical location of the worker. It's okay to move them between offices as long as they're working for the same employer. So sponsorship does not apply to a TN worker. Many employers in the U.S. don't fully understand this, and we are very happy, and we do regularly have meetings with U.S. employers to explain this, to walk through the process with them. So the takeaway here, the TN does not require sponsorship, as sponsorship is applied in other contexts like the H-1B, the L, and the employment-based green card context. Now, a specific nuance here that does not change what I just said, but is worth knowing. If there are several ways to apply for a TN. Those ways are at a port of entry. Okay, you can apply actually when you're at an airport or when you're crossing a land crossing, and that is available as a Canadian. Nationals of Mexico cannot apply at a port of entry. Mexicans and Canadians can apply at a consulate, and Mexicans and Canadians can apply within the U.S. through USCIS. If you're applying at a port of entry or at a consulate, that application is submitted by the employee. So it would be submitted by the prospective employee. So if the application is approved, it's the employee's application that's been approved. If it's been denied, it's the employee's application that's been denied. If you're filing within the United States through USCIS, it is the employer that submits that application. So they would sign the form, and if that application is denied, it is the employer's application that is denied. So the reason we put that on this slide is employers will oftentimes ask, well, but if I submit the application within the US through USCIS, I have to sign the application. So doesn't that create additional obligations on me? And the answer is no. Yes, you are making representations in the application, but the application is the same. Again, your requirements as an employer do not change. You have no prevailing wage. You don't need to test the labor market. All of the things I said before still apply. It's just that technically it is the employer that submits that application to USCIS and pays those application fees. So let's talk a little bit more about what I mentioned before about the differences in the application process for nationals of Canada and Mexico. So again, there are three ways to apply: port of entry, consulate, or USCIS. USCIS is only available for those in the US. Ports of entry that option is only available for nationals of Canada. Okay, so nationals of Mexico, if they're going to get a TN, they must apply either at a consulate or through USCIS. Nationals of Canada can be issued a TN visa for up to 3 years, and each time they enter the US, they are given 3 years of TN status. That is true also of nationals of Mexico. Each time they enter the US on their TN visa, they're given 3 years of TN status. So why would a national of Canada apply at a consulate? Since they can apply at a port of entry, and frankly, applying at a port of entry is the easiest option. So nationals of Canada really do have a huge benefit here. Applying at a port of entry is fast, it's cheap, you get an immediate decision, it's fairly streamlined. So really, you know, at a consulate, you're going to have to wait a period of time before they call you in for the interview. It is far easier to apply at a port of entry. So why would a Canadian apply at a consulate? The reason is that only nationals of Canada can apply to port of entry. So if your spouse does not have a Canadian passport, or if your child does not have a Canadian passport, and they're applying for a dependent TN visa called a TD visa, they must apply at the consulate. And if they have to apply at the consulate, oftentimes the principal applicant will apply at the consulate as well. But in pretty much all other examples, a national of Canada is going to apply at a port of entry, or if they're already in the U.S., there are certain circumstances where they'll apply through USCIS. But nationals of Canada rarely apply at consulates. Let's look at nationals of Mexico. So if they're outside the U.S., they must apply at a U.S. consulate. All right, they do have the option of paying for and receiving a 4-year visa. So this screen needs to be updated. It's not just increments of 1 year. Each time they enter the U.S., they're given 3 years of TN status. Okay, now, when I say 3 years of TN status, that can be limited. So for example, we'll talk later about how it can be strategically a good idea to request fewer than 3 years. If you request fewer than 3 years, you're likely to get fewer than 3 years when you enter the US. But typically, if you're requesting the full period of TN status, you're going to get 3 years of status each time you enter the US. For nationals of Mexico, they do have to renew at the consulate if they're going to renew their visa. And sometimes the consulate will allow them to renew through the mail. So they don't actually have to attend the interview at the consulate. They would be in Mexico, mail their passport to the consulate, and get the renewal that way. Now, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some uniquely difficult TN visa categories. So I mentioned before, looking at the TN regulations, you see dozens of professions, starting with accountant, going to economist, dentist, etc. Not all of those professions are as easy or as difficult to be approved for. 2 categories that are uniquely challenging are management consultants and economists. So let's talk about why each of these is uniquely challenging. If you remember, management consultants, this is one of the very few professional categories that can qualify where you can qualify without a degree. All right, almost any other profession, you need a degree. Even those categories where you can qualify based on a professional license, in order to get that professional license, you oftentimes do need the degree. So you think about lawyers, they can qualify if they have if they're admitted to the bar. All right, but to be admitted to the bar, you oftentimes need to complete law school. Management consultants don't have that requirement. They can actually qualify based on experience alone. And so, if a person is applying for a TN and they don't have a degree, regardless of what job they're going to be performing in the US, the management consultant category is going to be one of the only categories they can apply for because they don't have a degree. The government knows this. They know that the management consulting category really is a catch-all for people who don't have a degree. So this category is heavily scrutinized. All right. So consulates are going to heavily scrutinize it. The ports of entry are going to heavily scrutinize it. Now, that does not mean that a management consultant application is going to be denied. We get approvals for these frequently, but there are certain things to keep in mind. The first thing to keep in mind is that if you are applying to work as a management consultant for a management consulting firm in the US, so McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, Oliver Wyman, these are very common, big management consulting firms. If that's where you're going to work, this is not a risky category because it's very clear that you are going to be working as a management consultant. All right. Where this category is tricky and can be risky is if you're coming to the US to work for a company that is not a management consulting firm. So the example I like to use is, let's say there is a company in the US that designs and manufactures solar panels. And they want to hire a national of Mexico who has 2 decades of experience designing and manufacturing solar panels. And they want this person to come to the US to really help them improve their design and manufacturing process. That's an example where the employer, the company in the US, is not a management consulting firm. It's a solar panel company. All right? But they are inviting someone from Mexico to work for them as a consultant. He's going to be coming to address a very specific challenge that the company is facing. All right? So how do you structure that application to improve the chances that it will be approved? Overall, the important thing to keep in mind is that the government, when it sees one of these applications, it should look like a management consulting arrangement. What do I mean by that? And again, everything I'm about to say actually needs to be in reality. It's not appropriate to just structure the application, have the person come in and do whatever. That's not consistent with this. So you actually need to represent in your application what you actually will be doing in the US. That being said, how can you make this look like a management consulting agreement? Well, when McKinsey is hired by a company, and McKinsey sends a consultant to that company to advise the company, that company usually does not make the McKinsey consultant a W-2 full-time employee at the company, right? Instead, what oftentimes happens is there's a contract between the company and McKinsey. It's a management consulting agreement, and it defines what the management consultant's going to do, the time frame, how they're going to be paid. All right, and oftentimes that person is going to be paid as an independent contractor, or the consulting company is going to be paid for those services. So you want something very similar if you're in your TN application. So if the US company, let's go back to our example of the solar panel company, it would be ideal for that solar panel company to have a management consulting agreement with that consultant that defines what the consultant's going to do in months 1 through 3, 4 through 6, 7 through 9, 10 through 12. Exactly what the deliverables are going to be, how they're going to be paid based on those deliverables. That they're not going to be a full-time W-2 employee, but they're going to be an independent contractor. All right. Also, we talked about the time frame. Oftentimes, a management consulting arrangement isn't going to be for 3 years. That's a pretty long arrangement. So if you can lower the amount of time, reduce the number of years, that might strengthen your application because it looks more like a legitimate consulting arrangement. All right. So you want to think about these aspects. The U.S. company, if it's not a management consulting firm, it should define the specific challenge that they're facing. It should explain why the consultant that they want to hire is the best person to advise them. Explain that there's a management consulting agreement, include that agreement in the application, all the details of how the person is going to be paid and the deliverables they'll provide, and the time frame they need to address that challenge. That is what a management consulting arrangement looks like. Let's switch gears and talk about economists. So economists, this is another very challenging category, but it is challenging for completely different reasons. The reason economists have a difficult time is that there is a policy memo from November 2017 where the government limited what an economist does. So I said before, the Occupational Outlook Handbook is what defines what the government thinks someone in a certain profession does. So in 2017, the government made very clear, if someone's coming to the US to work as an economist on a TN visa, they need to be doing the job duties that are in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. All right, so step one, if you're applying as an economist, look at those job duties in the Occupational Outlook Handbook for economists. Make sure you're doing job duties closely aligned with those. This policy memo made very clear that economists do not work as financial analysts or as market research analysts. So you want to look at those pages of the Occupational Outlook Handbook for financial analysts and market research analysts and make sure you're not going to be doing those job duties. In general, financial analysts are working for financial institutions to find opportunities to generate profit, and market research analysts are looking for opportunities to market products or services. So make sure if you're applying as an economist, you are closely aligned with the job duties in the OOH for economists. All right, that's really critical. So what is the application process? So let me start by just saying what's included in a TN visa application, regardless of where you apply. You are going to include proof that you qualify. So again, we're talking about the TN regulations of how you qualify. So if you're applying as an economist, you're going to include proof that you have that bachelor's degree in economics. Even if the employer wants 20 years of experience, you're not going to include proof that you have those 20 years of experience. All right, that's not what we mean by qualifying. We mean qualifying based on the TN regulations. So if you're qualifying based on education, you want your diploma, proof that you have that degree. If your degree is related, you need that transcript showing the courses that you took that are related to the field of specialty, the field that you'll be practicing, the profession. If you're qualifying based on experience, so let's say a management consultant, 5 years of experience, you need original signed letters from past employers talking about how you do have that experience. All right, so proof that you qualify. That's going to be one of the key pieces in a TN application. The other key piece is going to be a letter from the U.S. employer. And this really is what explains the entire application. It's really an important part of the application because it explains who the U.S. employer is, why they need someone in this profession, who you are as the applicant and how you qualify based on the TN regulations. If there are aspects of you that the employer likes, so for example, this is where you might explain that you have that 20 years of experience, so you're going to be a great fit for this role. You're not going to say that's how you qualify for the TN, but you can say this is what the U.S. employer is looking for, and you have that qualification. Also, the job duties you're going to be performing in the U.S., that's very important. Again, that needs to be aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook. How much you're going to be paid in the role, your hours, etc. So that's going to be in the employer letter. So that's the second big part of a TN application. The first was how you qualify. The second is the employer letter. Of course, the application is going to include your passport. Now, what I just described, those three pieces, that's going to be in any TN application, whether it's at a port of entry, a consulate, or USCIS. So what are the differences depending on where you apply? At a port of entry, you are going to need originals of all of the documents I just described. An original signed letter from the employer, your passport, of course, original diploma, certified copies of transcripts. Do not bring copies to the port of entry. They encounter a high degree of fraud. They're going to want to see originals with original signatures. Same with a consulate. If you're applying at a consulate, you want to bring originals. The additional thing you need at a consulate is you'll submit a form DS-160. It's an online form. That's what you submit to the consulate online, and that starts your application process. They will then schedule you for an interview. You'll go in, you'll bring all those original documents, and if you're approved, you get your visa and the passport. At a port of entry, if you're approved, you'll just provide the originals that I just described. There's no separate form or anything at a port of entry. And if you're approved, they stamp your passport or they just admit you and you get a digital I-94 showing your TN status and the length of time. If you're applying through USCIS, your employer, again, is the one that's submitting the application, and they will file a form I-129, and they will include copies of all the documents, including a copy of your passport. All right, so no originals submitted to USCIS, and you do need to include that form I-129, and that is submitted by the U.S. employer. So let's talk about some tips and common pitfalls. So it is always a good idea to call the port of entry ahead of time if you're applying at an airport or at a border crossing, just to get a sense of what their hours are, if they have any unique procedures, just so that there are no surprises the day that you apply. Next, I mentioned the employer letter. So that letter is going to have the original signature of a company representative at the U.S. company. You want to make sure that that person is available at the time of your interview, whether that's at a consulate or at the port of entry. And the reason is that sometimes officers will call that person. And it's usually just a quick conversation to make sure that this job offer is legitimate, is bona fide. So just make sure to give that person a heads up. Hey, I'm probably going to be applying tomorrow between noon and 2 if you don't mind having your phone on you. It's just a good precaution. It doesn't happen often, but it's a good thing to do just to be safe. Next, at a port of entry or at the consulate, you need originals of your documents, okay? And that is absolutely critical. You don't want to be turned away just because you have copies, so get originals. Next, the TN visa is a temporary visa. It's a non-immigrant visa, okay? So it is not a green card, does not lead to a green card. So you may be required to show the officer your ties to your home country. Now, this usually does not come up the first or second time you've held a TN visa, but if you are on year 8, 9, 10 of your TN, you've renewed a few times, you might get questions along these lines. So it's best to come prepared. Come with a copy of your bank statement in your home country. If you have property, come with proof of ownership or that you have a lease agreement on that property. Whatever other documentation you have showing your ties to your home country. And I believe we got through all of the questions during our presentation. Please do keep an eye out for our follow-up email. We do hope to see you on future webinars, and we really appreciate you taking the time today. Stay well and have a great day. Thank you.